My name is Eleanor Hartley, and I am 44 years old, and I want you to understand something before I say another word. I want you to understand that the phone call that changed my entire life, the phone call that rewrote everything I thought I knew about my father and about myself, and about the 23 years of silence and distance and pain that had sat between us like a wall, that neither of us ever quite found the courage to climb over. That phone call did not come from a lawyer, and it did not come from a family member, and it did not come from anyone I had ever expected to hear from. In my entire life, it came from a woman named Diana Reeves, and Diana Reeves was my father's mistress. And when her name appeared on my phone screen on a Thursday evening in November, while I was sitting at my kitchen table in Nashville, Tennessee, with a cup of tea going cold beside me, and a stack of work files I was supposed to be reviewing, when I saw her name on that screen, I almost did not answer. I almost let it go to voicemail. I almost told myself that whatever Diana Reeves had to say to me was not something I needed to hear, because I had spent a very long time telling myself that the things connected to my father were not things I needed to engage with. I had spent a very long time building a life and a self that did not require my father's presence or his approval or his love, and I had done it well enough that most days I believed it completely. And then the phone rang, and it was Diana Reeves, and something in me, some part that was still the girl who had loved her father before she understood what loving him was going to cost her, that part picked up the phone and said hello. And Diana said Eleanor, and I said yes. And she said, my name is Diana Reeves, and I said, I know who you are, Diana. And she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, I need you to hear something. I need you to hear what your father told me about you. And those words, that sentence, landed somewhere so deep and so old inside me that I had to put my hand flat on the kitchen table to steady myself. And I said, okay, Diana, I said, tell me. And what she told me over the next 2 hours on that Thursday evening in November changed everything. It changed the way I understood my childhood and my father, and the will and the money, and the silence and the distance and the wall. It changed all of it, and I am going to tell you everything, every single piece of it, from the very beginning. Because the beginning is where the truth lives, and you cannot understand the ending without it, so let me take you back. Let me take you all the way back to a house in Memphis, Tennessee, in the 1980s, where a family lived that looked one way from the outside and was entirely something else from the inside. The way families do. The way the best and worst families always do. My father was a man named James Hartley, and James Hartley was the kind of man that rooms responded to. He was tall, and he had dark eyes that were always slightly amused, as though he knew something everyone else was still figuring out. And he had a voice that was low and certain, and that made whatever he was saying sound more important than it might have been in someone else's mouth. My father was a civil engineer who had built a small but successful engineering consulting firm in Memphis over the course of 15 years of hard work and strategic thinking. And the particular charisma that made clients trust him with significant projects and significant budgets. And he was charming in the way that certain men are charming, completely and instinctively and without apparent effort. As though the charm was not something he performed, but something he simply was. And I loved him the way daughters love fathers, who are charming and capable, and who make the world feel larger just by being in it. I loved him with the uncritical totality that children bring to loving parents before experience teaches them to love more carefully. And my mother was a woman named Rose Hartley. She was gentle and intelligent, and she had given up a promising career in art history to support my father's ambitions and raise their children. And she had done both things with a grace and a generosity that I understood only as an adult woman who had tried to do hard things gracefully and understood what that cost. And then there was my brother William, 4 years older than me. William, who was my father's favorite, in the specific way that firstborn sons are favored by ambitious fathers. William, who was being groomed from the time he could understand what grooming meant to take over the engineering firm eventually, to carry the Hartley name into the next generation of his business. And then there was me, Eleanor, the younger one, the daughter, the one who painted things and read constantly, and asked too many questions, and who my father loved in the way that I think he genuinely did love me. But loved the way you love something decorative, something you are proud of, without quite knowing what to do with. I was his daughter, and he was proud of me in a general and non-specific way that never quite translated into the focused, intentional investment he made in William. and I accepted this the way children accept the structures of their families, as simply the way things are, the natural order, the given conditions of the world. And my childhood was not unhappy. I want to say that clearly. It was not a miserable childhood. There were good things in it. There were summers at the lake house and dinners where my father told stories that made everyone laugh, and Christmases with the particular warmth that my mother created in every space she occupied. And there were moments with father that were real and close, and that I held on to for years after everything changed. Moments when he drove me to the library on Saturday mornings and let me choose anything I wanted, and then asked me about the books when I had read them. Moments when he came to my school art shows and stood in front of my paintings with genuine attention and said, "Eleanor, you see things differently than other people, and it's remarkable." Those moments were real and they mattered, and they are part of the complete picture, even though they make what came later more painful rather than less. And what came later started when I was 14. Though I did not understand at 14 what was starting, I understood it later when I had enough information to assemble the pieces into a picture. What started when I was 14 was my father's affair with a woman named Diana Reeves. Diana was 28 years old at the time. She worked as an accountant at a firm that did some work for my father's company, and she was, by any objective measure, a beautiful and intelligent woman. And my father was 42 years old and at the height of his professional success, and apparently at a point in his personal life where the things he had were not the things he wanted. And the affair began, quietly and without my knowledge and without my mother's knowledge, in the fall of the year I turned 14. And I did not know about it for 2 years. I did not know until I was 16. And I found something, a card in my father's jacket pocket, when my mother asked me to take his dry cleaning to the cleaners. A card in a woman's handwriting that said last night was everything, and was signed with a D and a small hand-drawn heart. And I stood in my parents' bedroom with that card in my hand. And I felt the specific cold shock of understanding something that rearranges the entire world you thought you were standing in. I was 16 years old and I was holding evidence of my father's betrayal of my mother, and I did not know what to do with it. I stood there for a long time, and then I put the card back in the pocket, and I took the dry cleaning to the cleaners. And I came home and I sat in my room, and I thought about what I had found and what it meant and what I was supposed to do. And I made a decision that a 16-year-old should never have to make. I decided to tell my mother. I decided that she deserved to know, and that knowing was better than not knowing, and that I was not going to be the person who kept this secret. And I told her that evening. I told her in her kitchen while she was making dinner, and she went very still when I told her, and she put down the spoon she was holding. And she turned to look at me and she said, "Are you sure, Eleanor?" And I said, "Yes, Mom, I'm sure." And my mother was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "Thank you for telling me, Eleanor." And she picked up the spoon and she went back to stirring the pot. And I stood there, not knowing what to do, and she said, "Go finish your homework, honey." And I went and finished my homework, and that night, I heard my parents talking in their bedroom for a very long time, voices too low to make out words, but with the specific texture of a conversation where something enormous is being negotiated. And the next morning, my father was at the breakfast table, and he looked at me across his coffee cup, and his expression was unreadable, and he said, "Good morning, Eleanor," and I said, "Good morning, Dad." And we ate breakfast and nothing was said, and I went to school and I thought about it all day. And when I came home, my mother told me that she and my father had talked and that things were going to be fine and that I should not worry. And I looked at my mother. And I wanted to believe her the way I had always believed her when she said things were going to be fine, and I tried to believe her. But the trying was harder than it had ever been before, and things were not fine. Things were fine on the surface, the way things are fine on the surface when two people have decided to maintain a surface for the sake of their children and their reputation and the life they have built. My father continued to live in the house and to come to dinner and to go to William's football games and to ask me about my painting and to be present in all the external ways that constitute being a husband and a father. And underneath the surface, nothing was fine, and I knew it. And my mother knew it, and I think William knew it, though William and I never talked about it directly. Because we were teenagers in a house where the adults had decided that direct conversation about the real thing was not going to happen, and the affair, I learned much later, did not end when I found the card. The affair continued. My father had told my mother something that night in their bedroom that was not the truth. He had told her the relationship was over, and he had told her convincingly enough that my mother had chosen to believe him, because choosing to believe him was the option that kept the family intact and kept her life intact. And when you have built your life and a structure, it is very hard to look directly at the evidence that the person and the structure are not what you thought they were. And so my mother believed what she needed to believe, and my father continued what he had been doing, and I went through the remaining 2 years of high school in that house, with the specific unhappiness of someone who knows something that they cannot unknow and cannot fully act on. And then I went to college. I went to the University of Tennessee in Knoxville on a partial scholarship, and I was genuinely glad to go. Glad in the complicated way that leaving a painful place makes you glad, even when the place is your home and the people are your family. And college was the beginning of the real me, the me that existed outside the structures of that Memphis house, and outside the particular emotional weather of my parents' marriage and my father's double life. I studied English literature, and I discovered that I was a good writer, and I wrote for the college paper, and eventually became an editor, and I found people who were interested in the same things I was interested in. And I built a life there that felt genuinely mine in a way that very little before it had felt, and I called my mother every week, and I went home for holidays, and I watched my parents perform their marriage with the weary professionalism of two people who have decided that performance is preferable to dissolution. And then my mother got sick. She was diagnosed with breast cancer when I was 20, and it was serious from the beginning. Serious in the way that certain cancers are serious when they have been given time to establish themselves before being found. And I went home and I was there as much as I could be, while still finishing my degree, and my mother fought with the same quiet, determined grace she brought to everything. And my father was present in a way that confused me. He was genuinely present, attentive and concerned, and at her side in the ways that mattered medically and practically. And I thought perhaps I had been wrong about him. Perhaps the crisis of my mother's illness had clarified something for him and brought him back to what was real. And then my mother died. She died on a Sunday morning in April when I was 21 years old and she was 48. And the world without her, in it was a different world, a colder and less navigable world. And I grieved her with everything I had, and I continued to grieve her for years, in the way that you continue to grieve mothers, who were genuinely good, who were the warmth and the grace of your childhood, who deserved so much better than what they got. And 3 months after my mother's funeral, 3 months, my father introduced Diana Reeves to William and me as his companion. That was the word he used, companion. And I looked at Diana Reeves across my father's living room, and I recognized her name from the card I had found in the jacket pocket 7 years earlier. And I felt something that I cannot fully describe even now. It was grief and rage, and the specific nauseating clarity of understanding that the affair had never ended, that my mother had spent the last 7 years of her life married to a man who was loving someone else, that she had died in a marriage that was a performance, while the real thing was happening somewhere else. And I looked at my father and I said nothing because I was 21 years old, and my mother had just died, and I did not have the words for what I felt. And even if I had had the words, I was not sure I had the right audience for them. Because my father was looking at me with an expression that was asking me to accept something, and I was not ready to accept it. And I was not sure I was ever going to be ready to accept it. And William handled it differently. William was 25, and he was already working at my father's firm. And he was practical, in the way that people who stand to inherit things are sometimes practical. He welcomed Diana into the family with a warmth that I found hard to watch, and that my father rewarded with an increased role at the firm and an expanded position, and what appeared to be an increasingly central place in my father's plans for the future of the business. And I went back to Knoxville, and I threw myself into finishing my degree, and I applied to graduate schools, and I got into a master's program in journalism at Vanderbilt, and I moved to Nashville, and I built my life there. And I called my father less and less frequently, and the calls became shorter and more formal, and the distance between us grew in the way that distances grow when neither person is willing to name the thing that is creating the distance. And I want to tell you about the years between 21 and 38. Because those years are important. They are the years when I became who I am, and when the life I had built became real and solid and mine. I finished my master's degree, and I got a job at a Nashville newspaper as a features writer, and I was good at it, the same way I had been good at writing in college, but now, with more skill and more experience, and the particular sharpness that comes from spending years paying close attention to people and their stories and their motivations. I wrote long-form pieces about real people and real situations, and I developed a reputation for being the person who found the true story underneath the presented story, the real thing underneath the performance, which perhaps should not have been surprising, given where I had learned that those two things were always different. And I was promoted, and I won awards, and I built a professional life that I was proud of in the complete and unqualified way that you are proud of something you built entirely on your own, without anyone's help, or anyone's connections, or anyone's money. And I made friends, and I had relationships. And eventually I met a man named Thomas Cole, who was a civil rights attorney, and who was as honest as he was smart, and who loved me in the specific way that feels like being truly seen. And Thomas and I built a life together in Nashville, a good life, a real life, with a house we bought together and a dog named Fitzgerald, who destroyed 3 pairs of shoes before he settled down in dinner parties, and the particular satisfaction of two people who have both done hard things independently and have chosen each other deliberately and freely. And I was happy. I want you to know that. I was genuinely happy. And the happiness existed alongside the grief for my mother and alongside the complicated unresolved thing with my father. Those things were all true at the same time, the way things in a real life are always true at the same time. And my father and I spoke on birthdays and at Christmas, and occasionally in between with the polite, careful brevity of two people who have decided not to have the real conversation. And Diana was part of his life, and he did not ask my permission for that, and I did not offer my opinion. And William remained close to my father. And to Diana, and the firm continued to grow, and my father aged and I aged. And the years went by with the particular speed that years have when you are living a full life and not counting them. And then I was 38, and my father called me on a Wednesday morning. And his voice was different, not his voice exactly, but the quality behind it. The certainty was gone, replaced by something tentative and slightly frightened. And my father had never in my memory sounded frightened. And he said, "Eleanor, I need to tell you something." And I said, "Okay, Dad." And he said, "I have been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer." And those 5 words landed like stones dropped into still water. And I felt the ripples move through me. And I said, "Dad." And he said, "It's serious." And I said, "How serious?" And he said, "Serious enough that I need to get my affairs in order." And I said, "I'm coming to Memphis." And he said, "You don't need to do that." And I sat across Memphis that weekend. And I sat across from my father in his living room. And I said, the living room of the house I had grown up in. And I looked at him, and he was thinner than I had seen him. And the dark eyes that had always been slightly amused were still and serious. And it looked like a man who was thinking about time in a way he had not thought about it before. And we talked, more honestly than we had talked in years. And I want to tell you that there was something in that conversations that was real and that I held on to. He asked about Thomas and about my work and about my life in Nashville, and he listened to my answers with genuine attention. And he said, "Eleanor, you have made something of yourself that I am proud of." And I said, "Thank you, Dad." And he said, "I know we have not been close." I said, "No, we haven't." And he said, "I regret that." And I said, "I know, Dad." And there were things I wanted to say that I did not say because he was ill and because some conversations, some phrases need a Mifa's living room can provide. And Benchervismia's living room can provide. And Diana was in the house, present but giving us space. And I watched her move through the kitchen and the hallway. And I thought about all the years and all the complicated feelings I had about this woman. And I was not ready to resolve them that afternoon. And I drove back to Nashville and I called Thomas. And I told him what my father had told me. And Thomas held me while I processed something that was not simple grief. It was grief mixed with all the unfinished things and all the unsaid words, and all the years of careful distance that had kept me from having the conversations that now might never happen. And my father's illness progressed faster than the doctors had initially projected. Pancreatic cancer has a particular cruelty in its pace when it decides to move. And over the following 8 months, I drove to Memphis regularly, and I sat with my father. And sometimes the conversations were real, and sometimes they were careful, and sometimes they were just two people sitting in the same room, knowing that the time was running out and not knowing how to use it properly. And Diana was always there, quietly and efficiently present, managing my father's care and his medications and his schedule with a competence and a tenderness that I observed and could not entirely dismiss no matter what I felt about the history. And William was there too. William, who had grown into a version of my father, tall and certain and present at the firm every day and at our father's side on weekends. And the three of us existed in that house and during those months in the particular uncomfortable proximity of people who have complicated relationships and a shared crisis, and not enough honesty between them to navigate the crisis cleanly. And then my father's attorney called me. He called me on a Monday morning 6 months into the illness. His name was Gerald Marsh, and he was a formal and precise man who had handled my father's legal affairs for 20 years. And Gerald said, "Eleanor, I am calling because your father has asked me to inform you that he has updated his will," and I said, "Okay." And Gerald said, "I want to be transparent with you because I believe you deserve that. The updated will leaves the entirety of your father's estate, including his share of Hartley Engineering, to Diana Reeves and to your brother William in equal portions." And I said, "I see." And Gerald said, "Eleanor, I am sorry." And I said, "Gerald, is there anything else?" And he said, "No, that is what I was asked to communicate." And I said, "Thank you, Gerald." And I hung up. And I sat at my kitchen table in Nashville with my phone in my hand, and I breathed. I breathed the way you breathe when something confirms what some part of you has always suspected, but that still lands with the full weight of something you had hoped was not true. And I thought about my mother, and I thought about her 48 years and her breast cancer, and her grace, and her crossword puzzles, and the way she had believed what she needed to believe. And I thought about my father, and his dark, amused eyes, and the Saturday morning library trips and the art shows, and the 23 years of affair. And I thought about the will, and the money, and William. And Diana, and I felt something move through me that was grief and anger. And something else, something that was almost a question I could not quite shape into words yet, but that was forming somewhere deep and insistent. And I drove to Memphis the following weekend, and I sat with my father, and I said, "Dad." I heard from Gerald Marsh, and my father looked at me, and he said, "I know." And I said, "Dad." And he said, "Eleanor, there are things I cannot explain right now." And I said, "Dad, I need you to try." And he looked at the window, and he said, "I have made decisions that I cannot undo, and I am asking you to trust that they were made for reasons." And I said, "Dad, what reasons?" And he said, "Eleanor," and his voice had something in it that I could not read, something that was not dismissal and was not coldness, something that was more like pain. And he said, "There are things you don't know." And I said, "Then tell me." And he said, "I can't, not yet." And I drove back to Nashville. And I told Thomas, and Thomas held me and said, "Eleanor, whatever he decides about his estate does not change who you are or what you have built." And I said, "I know, Thomas, I know." And Thomas was right. I knew he was right. The money was not the point. The estate was not the point. The point was the question that was forming in me. The question about what my father had meant when he said, "There are things you don't know." And my father died on a Thursday morning in March. He died with William and Diana at his side. And I arrived 2 hours after he was gone because the call came late. And the drive from Nashville took time, and I stood in his bedroom and I looked at him. And I said goodbye to a man who had been many things to me, a hero and a disappointment and a mystery, and my father, always my father, and the grief I felt standing there was real and complete and did not require resolution of anything else to be genuine. And the funeral happened, and the will was read formally. And it was exactly what Gerald had told me. The estate divided between William and Diana. Hartley Engineering going to William with a minority stake to Diana. The house and the investments, and the accounts going to Diana with a portion to William. And I sat in Gerald Marsh's office while he read the document, and I listened to every word. And I thought about my father saying, "There are things you don't know," and I held that thought like a stone in my hand, smooth and heavy and waiting. And 2 weeks after the funeral, 2 weeks after I had returned to Nashville and to Thomas and to Fitzgerald, the shoe-destroying dog, and to my work and my life, 2 weeks after I had begun the slow and nonlinear process of grieving a father who had been present and absent simultaneously for most of my adult life. On a Thursday evening in November, while I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold and a stack of work files I was supposed to be reviewing, my phone rang and the name on the screen was Diana Reeves. And I almost did not answer. And then I answered, and Diana said, "Eleanor," and I said, "Yes," and she said, "My name is Diana Reeves." And I said, "I know who you are, Diana." And she said, "I need you to hear something. I need you to hear what your father told me about you." And I put my hand flat on the kitchen table to steady myself. And I said, "Okay, Diana, tell me." And she told me. And I am going to tell you everything she said, every word of it. Because every word of it matters, and every word of it was the answer to the question that had been forming in me since the day Gerald Marsh called. Diana said, "Eleanor, I have been trying to decide whether to make this call for 2 weeks, and I have decided that not making it would be a worse thing than making it, and so I am making it, and I need you to just listen until I am finished." And I said, "Okay." And she said, "Your father loved you," and she said it simply and directly, and without preamble, and those 3 words hit me somewhere that I had not known was still open. And I was quiet, and she continued. She said, "Your father loved you in a way that he did not know how to show you, and that he did not believe he had the right to show you after what happened with your mother." And I said, "What do you mean, Diana?" And she said, "Eleanor, your father knew what telling your mother about the affair cost you. He knew that you were the one who told her. And he knew what that did to your relationship with him afterward, and he blamed himself for putting you in that position. He blamed himself for the fact that you found that card, and he blamed himself for the affair. And he blamed himself for the distance that grew between you after your mother died. And he carried that blame for 23 years. And I was very still and very quiet. And I said, "Diana, why are you telling me this?" And she said, "Because he asked me to, Eleanor, he asked me to call you after he was gone and tell you what he could not tell you himself." And I said, "Why couldn't he tell me himself?" And she said, "Because he was ashamed, Eleanor. Your father was deeply ashamed of what he had done, and the shame was so complete that it had closed off the path back to you. He did not know how to apologize for something so large without making it worse. And he was afraid. Your father was afraid of you. Afraid of what you thought of him, and afraid that anything he said would sound like an excuse. And he did not want to make excuses. He wanted to tell you the truth, but he could not find the beginning of it. And so he lived with the distance, and he hated the distance every single day. And I said, Diana, and my voice was not entirely steady. And she said, "I know, Eleanor. I know." And then she said, "There is more." And I said, "Tell me." And she said, "Your father changed his will." She said he changed it to leave you out. And I said, "I know, Diana, Gerald Marsh told me." And she said, "Eleanor, do you know why?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Because he had already given you something else, something separate from the will, something that he arranged before he died and that does not go through the estate." And I said, "What, Diana? What did he give me?" And she said, "Eleanor, your father established a trust for you 15 years ago. 15 years ago, when he understood that his relationship with you was broken in ways he did not know how to fix, and when he decided that the only thing he could do that would be honest was to make sure you were provided for in a way that did not depend on his will, or on his other relationships, or on anyone else's decisions. He established a trust in your name and he funded it every year for 15 years. And the trust has been growing and accumulating for 15 years. And I said, Diana, and I stopped because I did not have words. And she said, Eleanor, the trust is significant. She said, I am not going to give you the number on the phone because it needs to come from the attorney who manages it, but I want you to know that your father thought about you every year when he made his contribution, and he thought about the Saturday morning library trips, and the art shows and the paintings and the way you see things differently than other people. And he said that every time, every single year, he said Eleanor sees things differently than other people. And it is remarkable, and I put my face in my hands at my kitchen table in Nashville, and I cried. I cried in the complete and uncontrolled way that you cry when something releases a pressure that has been building for so long that you had stopped feeling it as pressure and had started accepting it as simply the weight of things. And Diana was quiet on the other end of the phone, and she let me cry, and when I came back, she said, Eleanor, there is one more thing. I said, okay. And she said, your father wrote you a letter. He wrote it 6 months before he died, and he gave it to his personal attorney, a different attorney from Gerald Marsh, a man named Robert Chen in Memphis. And the letter is with Robert Chen, and Robert is expecting your call. And I said, Diana, and she said yes. And I said, why did you do this? Why did you make this call? And she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, because your father was a good man who made serious mistakes. And the most serious mistake he made was letting you believe that you did not matter to him. And I could not let that be the ending of his story with you. And I said, Diana, I don't know what to say to you. And she said, you don't have to say anything, Eleanor. Just call Robert Chen. And I said, okay, and we were both quiet for a moment, and then she said, Eleanor, I am sorry. I am sorry for my part in all of it. in the affair, and in what it did to your mother, and in what it did to you and your father. I was 28 years old, and I made choices that I have carried the weight of every day since. And I am sorry, and I said, Diana, and I stopped. And then I said, I believe you. And she said, thank you, and we said goodbye. And I sat at my kitchen table for a very long time after that call, sat with everything Diana had said and everything it meant, and the 15-year trust, and the letter, waiting with Robert Chen, and the image of my father making a contribution every year, and thinking about the library trips, and the art shows, and saying, Eleanor sees things differently than other people. And it is remarkable. And I called Thomas, and he came and sat with me, and I told him everything, and he held my hand across the kitchen table, and he said, Eleanor, and I said, I know, Thomas. And he said, are you okay? And I said, I don't know yet. And he said, that's okay, and it was okay. It was enough. And the next morning I called Robert Chen, and he was warm and professional. And he said, Miss Hartley, your father left specific instructions. And he said the trust documents and the letter you want to come to Memphis. And I said, I will come this week. And I drove to Memphis on a Thursday. And I sat in Robert Chen's office. And he gave me the trust documents first. And I looked at the numbers, and I will not tell you the exact amount, because it is, but I will tell you that it was more than I had expected and more than I needed. And it was 15 years of my father thinking about me every year and doing the one thing he knew how to do, which was to ensure my security even when insurer Tamays. And where he could not ensure our closeness. And then Robert Chen gave me the letter. He gave me a sealed envelope with my name on it, in my father's handwriting. Eleanor, just my name, in the handwriting I had known my entire life. And I held it for a moment before I opened it. And Robert said, I will give you some privacies, and he left the room. And I opened the envelope and I read my father's letter. And I am going to share parts of it with you because my father wrote it to be shared eventually. He wrote it knowing that Diana would make the call and knowing that I would come to Robert's office. And he wrote it as a public accounting of a private wrong. And he deserves to have it witnessed, he wrote. My dear Eleanor, I have spent 30 years being better at building things than maintaining them. And you are the greatest cost of that failure, he wrote. You were 12 years old when I began the affair, and you were 16 when you found the evidence of it, and you were brave enough and honest enough to tell your mother, when I had not been either of those things. And the bravery and the honesty you showed at 16 were things I should have honored, and instead I let them become a wall between us, because facing your knowledge of what I had done required me to veil what I had done. And I was not ready to do that for a very long time, and by the time I was ready the distance had become familiar, and I did not know how to cross it. He wrote, your mother was a better person than I deserved, and she knew what I was, and she loved me anyway. And I failed her in the most fundamental way a husband can fail a wife, and the grief of that failure has been with me every day since she died. He wrote, you have built a life that is entirely your own, and you have built it without my help or my presence. And the pride I feel about that is complicated by the shame of knowing that my absence was not your choice but mine. He wrote, the trust is not an apology, because an apology requires conversation, and I have been too cowardly for that conversation. The trust is simply what I owe you, a portion of what I built that should always have been part of your foundation. He wrote, I know you see things differently than other people, Eleanor. You always have. You see the true thing underneath the presented thing. And I have spent 23 years being grateful that you lived far enough away that your clear vision could not land on me directly. But I want you to know that the clarity you have, the ability to see what is real, is the most valuable thing I gave you. And it was not even something I gave you. It was something you came into the world with and something you cultivated entirely on your own. And he ended the letter with this. He wrote, I love you, Eleanor. I have always loved you, and I have not always known what to do with that love. And the things I did not know what to do with cost us both something irreplaceable. Please forgive me if you can, and if you cannot, please know that I understand and that I love you still, your for James. And I sat in Robert Chen's office with that letter in my hands, and I cried again, differently from how I had cried at the kitchen table. This was quieter and older, the crying of someone who has received an answer to a question they have been carrying for 23 years, and who is learning what it feels like to put the question down. And I folded the letter carefully, and I put it back in the envelope, and I put the envelope in my bag, and I thanked Robert Chen, and I drove home to Nashville, and I went into the house, and Thomas was there, and Fitzgerald was there. And I sat on the couch, and Tata was there, and I sat on the couch to me, and I told him about the letter, and I read him parts of it. And we sat gatherings in the Nashville evening, and I thought about my father and my mother and Diana and William and all of it, the whole enormous, complicated, painful, beautiful mess of it. And I thought about what Diana had done, what she had chosen to do, making that call, carrying my father's message after his death, accepting the responsibility of delivering the truth that he had not been able to deliver himself. And I thought about how easy it would have been for her not to make that call, to simply receive the estate and move forward and let Eleanor Hartley remain in the dark about the trust and the letter and the 15 years of annual contributions and the thought about the library trips and the art shows and the seeing things differently, how easy it would have been and how wrong. And I picked up my phone and I called Diana and she answered and I said, Diana, and she said, yes, Eleanor, and I said, thank you. And she said, Eleanor, and I said, no, Diana, I need to say it properly. Thank you for making that call. Thank you for doing what he asked you to do, and more than what he asked you to do. Thank you for being honest with me about your own part in it, and thank you for being present with him when he was dying, in the way that someone who genuinely loved him would be present. And she was quiet. And then she said, I did love him, Eleanor. I want you to know that, whatever the complications of how it began, I loved your father and I was with him, because I loved him not for any other reason. And I said, Diana, I believe you. And she said, do you really? And I said, yes, I really do. And we talked for another hour that evening, Diana and I. And I learned things about my father that I had not known. I learned that he had attended every major event of my career, that he could find public information about, that he had read every article I had ever published that he could access online, that he had a folder in his home office. Diana told me this, a physical folder with printed copies of my published work going back 15 years, that he had told Diana stories about me regularly, about the library, trips, and the art shows, and the questions I used to ask that made him think harder than he expected. I learned that my father had been proud of me in a specific and sustained and private way that had never found its way to me directly, because the shame and the distance had blocked the channel, and learning these things did not undo the distance and did not resurrect the years we had not had, and did not bring my mother back or give her the husband she deserved. It did none of those things, but it did something else. It did something that I had not known I still needed. It gave me the complete picture, and the complete picture was painful and complicated and human, in the way that complete pictures always are. It was not a picture of a villain and a victim. It was the picture of a flawed man who had done serious damage and who had spent the rest of his life carrying the weight of that damage and trying to compensate for it in the ways he knew how to compensate. Through money and through the private maintenance of connection, even when the public connection was broken. And I could hold that picture. I could hold the full complexity of it. Because I had spent my entire career learning to hold the full complexity of people and their stories, and I could extend that skill to my own story, to my own father. And in the weeks and months that followed, I did several things that felt important, and that I want to tell you about, because they are part of the ending, and the ending matters as much as the beginning. The first thing I did was call William. I called my brother and I told him about Diana's call and about the trust and about the letter and about the folder in the home office with my printed articles. And William was quiet for a long time, and then he said, Eleanor, I didn't know about the trust. And he said, I knew he thought about you, but I didn't know it was like that. And I said, I know, William. And he said, I should have pushed harder for the two of you to talk. And I said, William, you couldn't have made that happen any more than I could have. And he said, I know, but I should have tried. And I said, yes, you should have. And we sat with that for a moment. And then he said, I'm glad Diana called you. And I said, so, am I's, Willem. William, so am I. And William and I began talking more regularly after that. Not perfectly and not without the accumulated awkwardness of years of managed distance, but genuinely, in the way that adults who have been through something significant together sometimes finally find the real conversation that the significant thing has been pointing toward all along. And the second thing I did was visit my mother's grave. I drove to the cemetery in Memphis, and I sat on the bench near her stone. And I talked to her. I told her about Diana's call, and the trust, and the letter, and the folder. I told her about everything. And I told her that I was sorry. I was sorry that her marriage had not been what it appeared to be. And I was sorry that she had spent years believing something that was not true, and I was sorry that she had not had the full picture, because she deserved the full picture. She deserved everything, and she had not gotten everything. And that was a wrong that could not be made right, and I sat with the impossibility of that, and I cried. And then I told her that I was okay, that I had built something real, and that Thomas was good, and that Fitzgerald had finally stopped destroying shoes, and that my work was meaningful, and that I was okay. I was genuinely okay. And I told her I loved her, and I drove back to Nashville. And the third thing I did was write. I wrote about everything. I wrote the long-form piece that I had been carrying inside me for 23 years, without knowing it. I wrote about fathers and daughters, and the damage that shame does to love, and the ways that people try to compensate for irreversible wrongs through the only channels still available to them, and the specific grief of receiving an apology. After the person who owes it is no longer there to receive your response. I wrote it with everything I had, with every skill I had developed over 20 years of journalism, and with the particular authority of someone who has lived the story they are telling, and I submitted it to a national magazine, and they published it. And the response was extraordinary in the way that responses to true things told truly are, sometimes extraordinary. People wrote to me from every state and several countries, people who had lost fathers, and people who had complicated relationships with living ones, and people who had been the keepers of family secrets, and people who had been the recipients of posthumous revelations, and people who simply recognized something true in what I had written and wanted to say so. And I read every message. And I responded to as many as I could, and I understood for the first time with complete clarity why I had become a writer. Not just because I was good at it, but because the writing was the thing I could do with everything I had been given and everything I had survived. The tool I had for making the private true thing into something that could reach other people and tell them they were not alone in whatever complicated human experience they were navigating. And I want to tell you where I am now. I am 44 years old, and I am in my office in Nashville on a Tuesday morning. And through the window, I can see the garden that Thomas and I planted last spring, and Fitzgerald is asleep in a patch of sunlight on the office floor. And on my desk, there is an envelope with my name on it in my father's handwriting. Eleanor, just my name, and then inside it is worn along the folds from being read many times. And it is the most important thing on my desk, even on the days when my desk is covered in work that the world considers more important. And I want to say something to you about Diana Reeves, because Diana Reeves deserves to be talked about honestly, and not simply as the villain that the structure of this story might make her appear to be. Diana was not a simple villain, and her story was not a simple story, and the choice she made to call me after my father died was not a small or an easy choice, and it was the right choice, and I am grateful for it. I am grateful in the specific way that you are grateful for someone who delivers a painful truth, because they understand that painful truths are better than comfortable lies, and that the person who needs the truth deserves to have it, regardless of how complicated the delivery is. And Diana and I are not friends. I want to be honest about that. We are not building a relationship, and we are not having regular phone calls. And the history is too complicated and too layered for anything like friendship to develop easily, or perhaps at all. But we are honest with each other when we speak, and we speak occasionally. And she tells me things about my father that I would not know otherwise, and I receive those things with the gratitude they deserve. And I think that is the right relationship for what we are to each other. Two women connected by a man who loved us both in different ways, and who was not always honest about either love, but who was real in his feeling even when he was not real in his behavior. And I want to say something about forgiveness, because people always want to know about forgiveness in stories like this. They want to know whether I have forgiven my father, and whether the forgiveness is complete, and whether it came easily or with difficulty, and whether it feels the way they imagine it feels. And what I want to say about forgiveness is this. Forgiveness is not a single moment, and it is not a decision you make once, and then it is done. It is a practice. It is something you do repeatedly and imperfectly over time, and I practice it with my father. I practice it when I read his letter, and when I think about the folder with my printed articles, and when I think about the Saturday morning library trips and the art shows, and when I think about how shame closed off the path back to me, and how he lived with that closure every day, and how he did what he could with the channels that were still open to him, I practice forgiving him, and some days the practice is easier than others. And on the hard days, I do not force it. I just acknowledge that it is hard. And I keep going. And I practice forgiving myself too. Forgiving the younger version of me who carried the weight of the family's secret, and who could not find a way through the distance, and who sometimes let the anger be louder than the love. And I want to say one more thing before I finish. I want to say it directly and clearly to anyone who is listening to this right now and who is carrying something similar. Anyone who has a complicated relationship with a parent and who has let the complications prevent the honest conversation. Anyone who is waiting for the right moment, or the right words, or the right emotional conditions to have the real conversation with someone they love and who have hurt them or who they have hurt. I want to say, do not wait. Please do not wait. The conversation does not have to be perfect, and the words do not have to be exactly right, and the emotional conditions are never going to be ideal, and the person you need to have the conversation with is not going to be available forever. And the letter that my father wrote to me was real, and it was precious. And it was also too late in the specific way that posthumous letters are always too late, not worthless, never worthless, but too late to be answered, too late to be part of a real exchange, too late to become the beginning of something rather than just the ending of something. And I would have given anything. I would have given the trust and the money, and every published article in that folder. I would have given all of it for one real conversation with my father, while he was alive and able to hear my response, for 1 hour of the honest exchange that the letter almost was but could not fully be, because letters go only one direction and real-time conversations go both ways. So please, whoever you are, wherever you are listening from, do not let the shame or the distance or the complicated feelings be the reason the conversation does not happen. Make it happen while it still can, while the person is still there to hear you and to answer, while there is still time to let the conversation become the beginning of something, rather than just the record of what was lost. And if you are someone who has already lost the chance, if you are someone who is holding a letter like mine, or a message like Diana's call, or some other posthumous truth that arrived after the person who should have delivered it was gone, I want you to know that the truth arriving late is still the truth. It still matters. It still changes things in the ways that truth changes things. It just also breaks your heart a little that it did not arrive sooner, and that breaking and that mattering can exist at the same time. They do exist at the same time. They exist in me every day, alongside the love and the grief and the gratitude and the complicated, imperfect, ongoing practice of forgiveness. And I am Eleanor Hartley, and I am 44 years old, and I am sitting in my office in Nashville on a Tuesday morning. And my father loved me, and he did not always know how to show me, and he spent 15 years trying to compensate for that in the ways available to him. And a woman named Diana Reeves made a phone call on a Thursday evening in November, because she understood that the truth belonged to me, regardless of how complicated the delivering of it was. And I answered the phone when I almost did not. And everything changed. Everything became more complete and more painful, and more true and more bearable all at once. And that is the story. That is all of it. The whole enormous, complicated human thing of it. And if it has meant something to you today, if you have heard something in it that belongs to your own story, or your own family, or your own complicated love for someone who hurt you, or who you have hurt, please leave a comment and tell me. Tell me where you are listening from, and what part of this landed deepest for you. Because the comments on stories like this are where the real conversation happens, where people who have been carrying things quietly find out that other people have been carrying the same things, and that finding out is its own kind of healing. Subscribe if you believe that truth matters even when it arrives late, and even when it arrives through unexpected messengers, on Thursday evenings in November, because there are more stories coming, and every single one of them is about someone who received the full picture eventually and learned to hold it with both hands. I will see you in the next one.